Welcome, everyone, to a journey into one of the most explosive and revolutionary ideas in modern philosophy. Today, we are diving deep into the mind of Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically exploring the core concepts of his groundbreaking work, The Birth of Tragedy, and mapping what we call the tragic spirit. We are going to trace a visual genealogy of Western rationality clashing head on with primal instinct. We will see exactly how the ancient Greek tragic synthesis was destroyed by theoretical optimism, leading to the subsequent crisis of European nihilism, and ultimately, how we might find aesthetic justification for our lives. Let us jump right in. Let us start with a rather dark story from ancient Greek mythology. King Midas captures a mythical creature named Silenus, demanding to know what is the absolute most desirable thing for humankind. Silenus gives a chilling existential verdict: best not to be born, second best to die soon. You see, we often picture the ancient Greeks as naturally optimistic, walking around in white togas discussing geometry, but the truth is they possessed a profound, paralyzing awareness of the inherent terror, suffering, and absurdity of unmediated reality. To be able to live at all, they had to confront this horror head on. To understand how they coped, we have to enter the domain of Dionysus. While we typically know him as the god of wine, here the Dionysian drive represents the chaotic, overflowing force of life, intoxicating frenzy, and non visual musical vitality. Imagine being at a massive, thumping music festival where the bass vibrates in your chest and you completely lose yourself. That raw, primal energy is the Dionysian drive. The Dionysian posture towards reality does not shrink from the terror of existence. Rather, it embraces the sublime truth of suffering without a filter of illusion. What happens when this wild Dionysian force takes over? It leads to the dissolution of the principle of individuation. This force shatters the boundaries that separate individuals from one another and from nature itself. It breaks the individual back into the primal abyss through biological intoxication and total emotional release, while the destruction of the individual is the highest pain imaginable. It simultaneously extinguishes the root of all suffering by reuniting the human psyche with the primordial unity of existence. You lose your ego, but you gain a feeling of ecstatic universal wholeness. But human beings cannot live in that chaotic, ecstatic abyss forever. We would literally lose our minds. This brings us to the domain of Apollo, the god of light, and the absolute psychological necessity of illusion. The Apollonian drive is a psychological compulsion to create protective boundaries, beautiful illusions, and measured forms to shield the human psyche from the raw terror of the abyss. It constructs what is called the veil of Maya, creating a necessary, self-generated dream state that makes the horrors of existence bearable. Think of it as the beautiful psychological armor we wear just to get through the day. How did the Greeks visualize this necessary illusion? Through the plastic arts, sculpture, architecture, and epic poetry, like the magnificent works of Homer, the god of light renders the terrors of reality bearable by constructing a pristine, measured dream reality. The naive, serene harmony of the Greeks was not just some natural, relaxed state, but rather the supreme achievement of Apollonian culture, actively conquering a terrifying Titangent realm. It is like building a gorgeous, serene marble temple right on the edge of a violent, erupting volcano. Let us compare these active forces directly, side by side. It is like looking at a parameter comparison of the human psyche itself. Dionysus represents intoxication and frenzy, expressed artistically through non-visual music and the chorus. His relation to reality is the dissolution into universal unity, and his coping mechanism is embracing raw suffering. Apollo, entirely opposed, represents the dream and meditation, expressed through sculpture, architecture, and epic poetry. His realm is a strict individualization, and he copes by constructing aesthetic illusions. They are diametrically opposed psychological parameters, yet intimately connected. This brings us to the metaphysical equation and the actual genesis of Attic tragedy. Greek culture required continuous generative friction between the terror of the abyss and the protection of the dream. Without Dionysus, art lacks vital life blood and primal truth. But without Apollo, raw reality simply destroys the human mind. When you synthesize the Dionysian base with the Apollonian veil, you get true metaphysical consolation. Attic tragedy is born precisely when Apollonian form casts a structured, beautiful veil over the terrifying Dionysian truth. To truly grasp how brilliant this is, look at the physical architecture of the tragic stage, which literally operates as an engine of synthesis. Down in the circular orchestra, the tragic chorus embodies the chaotic primal Dionysian will, drawing the audience into a state of collective musical intoxication. Upon the elevated stage, the structured vision of the dialogue and the masked hero project, a beautiful, bearable Apollonian dream image. The audience gets to experience the primal joy of destruction safely through the protective illusion of the stage. But this perfect tragic synthesis was fatally disrupted by a historic rupture brought about by Socratic rationalism and the eradication of instinct. Socrates introduces a fatal paradigm shift that destroys the tragic synthesis entirely. He brings in the core doctrine that ultimately kills tragedy. To be beautiful is to be intelligible. This is theoretical optimism, the hubris of logic, the invasive, arrogant belief that conscious reason, dialectics, and scientific calculation can not only understand existence but actually correct it, curing the eternal wound of suffering. We are witnessing a fundamental paradigm shift in how humanity attempts to justify the suffering of existence, the theoretical man versus the tragic artist. The tragic worldview is driven by unconscious instinct and primal energy, embracing inherent suffering as an absolute necessity. But the theoretical worldview, championed by Socrates and the playwright Euripides, is driven entirely by conscious reason and dialectic. It denies inherent suffering, believing logic cures all, and tries to justify life strictly through logical morality rather than as a profound aesthetic phenomenon. How exactly does this Socratic logic destroy myths? Through artificial mechanisms like the deus ex machina. By demanding conscious understanding, Socratic dialectical optimism literally chokes the unconscious lifeblood of art. Euripides and Socrates replaced the organic, musical resolution of myth with artificial, logical interventions and neat moral equations. Without the Dionysian terror underlying it, the Apollonian dream simply degrades into shallow bourgeois entertainment. The profound magic of myth is replaced by a crane lowering a fake god onto the stage to magically solve everyone's problems. This rationalism eventually evolves into what we can call the Platonic Christian Alliance and the ascetic ideal. We see the massive influence of Plato here as Socratic rationalism merges with Christian theology, splitting reality cleanly in two. The earthly realm of instinct, body, and suffering is heavily devalued in favor of an imaginary, perfect, purely logical, true world. This leads directly to the ascetic ideal, which is the ultimate denial of life. Primal earthly instincts are turned inward, resulting in self mutilation and the total rejection of earthly vitality. But here is the fascinating, inevitable twist, the autophagy of reason, where the will to truth actually turns on itself. The very same scalpel of analytical psychology and intellectual honesty used to ruthlessly dissect human motives and destroy old illusions becomes a fierce predator. The rigorous demand for objective truth that started with Socrates eventually leads to the terrifying realization that all truth is merely an interpretation driven by physiological drives. reason effectively ends up eating its own tail, destroying the very foundation it was built upon. The direct result of this is the complete collapse of absolute values. We are looking at a massive structural failure as the 2 millennia old metaphysical worldview entirely collapses under the weight of modern scientific deduction. With the so-called true world exposed as nothing but an illusion, the psychological safety nets of objective morality, divine justice, and inherent historical purpose simply evaporate into thin air. It is a terrifying freefall into existential uncertainty. This freefall brings us to the European crisis of nihilism, famously summarized by the chilling declaration, God is dead. This is not merely about atheism or a simple loss of religious faith. It is a terrifying ontological event. It marks the complete evaporation of all absolute objective meanings and moral compasses. Humanity is left totally unmoored, bleeding out in a meaningless, mechanical universe without any inherent goal or ultimate justification for our suffering. So, we are left staring at the problem of pessimism, standing at a monumental philosophical crossroads. In the wake of the death of God, how does modern humanity interpret the inherent suffering of a world that is now explicitly meaningless? We are forced to choose between two fundamentally opposed forms of pessimism: the pessimism of decline, resignation, and decay, or the pessimism of overabundance, affirmation, and creative destruction. Let us look at the first path, represented by the dialectical contrast of Arthur Schopenhauer and the pessimism of weakness, confronted with the utterly meaningless suffering of existence. Schopenhauer's logic dictates a full retreat. It is a pessimism born of pure exhaustion, where the ultimate goal becomes the complete cessation of desire, asceticism, and a passive resignation before the abyss. It seeks to escape suffering through the negation and denial of life itself. But Friedrich Nietzsche offers a radically different path: the pessimism of strength. Nietzsche violently flips the logic. Life is not a passive struggle for mere survival or a cowardly attempt to escape pain, but an aggressive, expansive drive for self overcoming, known as the will to power. The Overman, or Übermensch, demands the terrible and painful not as a symptom of sickness, but of a overflowing titanic strength. He actually requires resistance and suffering to exert his creative will upon the world. This heroic stance leads us directly to Amor Fati, the love of fate, and the joyful affirmation of life. True liberation is not merely bearing what is necessary, nor concealing it, but actively loving the abyss. The pessimism of strength demands that if we were to live our exact lives over and over again for eternity, the eternal return, we would joyfully shout yes to every single pain, every contradiction, and every tragedy, because they are the absolutely necessary friction for greatness. And so we arrive at the ultimate aesthetic justification. Existence is justified strictly as an aesthetic phenomenon. We must return to the deep roots of tragedy with a modern, post-nihilist consciousness, resurrecting the Dionysian spirit. True art is not a reflection of logic, but the highest mechanism of survival. It is the only force capable of transforming the raw terror of reality into a beautiful, necessary aesthetic game. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the tragic spirit, and may you find the strength to beautifully and creatively affirm the chaotic tragedy of your own life.